Hi guys, welcome. Also, I wave. No one can see that I'm waving, but I'm waving.
Hello.
We have Nick, who you guys know, and we have Philip, who some of you know, hopefully. Like people who
Hello.
like you remember Rick, who used to, who stream you were on. So he's streaming right
Yes.
now. It's like his entire community is busy watching that. But I'm sure once he's done, they'll come over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Ricky's always having a long program. Like he could stay hours.
Yeah, he does. But the longest he had was 9 hours. And I know because I was on that stream.
Yeah.
But he's actually started cutting it shorter now. So he's
Mm,
streaming more frequently, but shorter stints, but it's still like a few hours.
yeah.
But yeah. Um, yeah. How have you been?
Very good. Very good. Been
Good
all
and
over the
busy.
place. Yeah, I'm always busy. I did not know, Nick. I've spent the last 5 years or thereabout focusing a lot on investigating Russian operations across Africa. What I did not know in the beginning was that it will get to a point where I will have very little rest. So I thought this work would be when I have time, I investigate, and then I file my story, and that's it. But now I have come to realize that this work never ends because there are a lot of people asking for media appearances, others are asking to travel somewhere to speak, and then the people also sending scoops to you, you know, and then it keeps coming every day. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah, guys, speaking of work, Philip's GoFundMe is pinned in the chat. It's already pinned there. And then also Keith, our awesome mod, has dropped the link to Philip's Twitter. He's also on Instagram. You can just search for Philip Obaji. You'll find him. He's like number one.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Awesome. So actually, like you remember, so I see you tweeted about the Alabuga thing in Russia. For those of you who
Yeah,
don't know, it's a factory in a region of Russia where they get women from Africa and South America, and I think Southeast Asia as well, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken, to
that's
go
correct.
and between the ages of 18 to 22 to go and work there. They sell it as like a great career opportunity, but they're building drones. And I was actually surprised by how long it took South African media to pick up the story because it was big news last year and in 23 across the world. And it was completely silent in South Africa. And then it blew up when a TikToker now posted about it. And she since apologized but it was for the first time South African media were like, oh, we'll look into it. And I'm like, all the links are already here. You can go look it up, So it's almost like that blissful ignorance or on purpose ignorance.
Well, I will tell you the little I know about the whole Russia interference in Africa and how it's perceived in South Africa. I was in Joburg in around October 2024, and I was attending the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference, the AIJC. So I had to speak on that stage about Russian interference, and I came to realize that not many people in South Africa are aware of what Russia is doing in Africa, and also not many people even care about what's going on. So that's what I came to realize. And I think because there's been a lot of, working together alliances between the ANC and the Russian Federation. So a lot of people think, well, can we just not just try new partners? And we go back to history. I know
Mm.
that the Soviets were so very much in support of the South Africans
But you know what the
during
interesting thing
apartheid.
is,
Yeah.
right? If
So yeah,
it was Ukraine that was helping. Um,
after they followed this, okay, you tell me.
yeah, so
But
they were, it
during
was,
during the era of the Soviet Union, I
Yeah,
mean, at the
it
time,
was the
Ukraine, Russia.
Ukrainian
Yeah.
Socialist Soviet Republic
Oh, really?
that held the chair against apartheid and that put forward the motion against apartheid at the UN.
Do many South Africans know this? Do South Africans know this?
No,
That's the thing.
because Russia adopted that,
Yeah.
like they did at the UN Security Council, where they just
Mm-hmm.
took the seat of the Soviet Union. They did the same with all the embassies across Africa.
Okay.
Um, and they've been like just keeping up that pressure for 30 years long, you know.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at where all the freedom fighters in South Africa
Mm.
received training when they were in the USSR, it was Kherson, Odessa,
Okay,
Kharkiv,
I see.
you know, but
Why?
that's not spoken about, you know. Recent, I think it was last year, they unveiled the plaque to one of the guys at there's a monument somewhere, at Freedom Park, where they have the names of everyone who helped
Mm.
against apartheid, who helped to fight against apartheid. And they unveiled it, I think last year or the year before. But
Oh,
only
wow.
one there. There's no Russian name there. There's just a Ukrainian name there because the
Interesting.
Russians weren't doing it. If you actually look into it, the Russians were trading with the apartheid government.
Oh, I see. Nick,
They were,
are you aware
yeah,
of this? Because I'm actually,
Am I what? Sorry.
are you aware of this?
aware of this.
I think I remember Yana telling me about this at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
So
that
so
idea, apart from that, I wouldn't have known.
Oh, so Jana, you see, this is not what many people are
mm,
aware of. I'm sure even in South Africa, there may not be too many people who really know this history, and certainly not in the rest of Africa, because
mm.
yeah, if a lot of West Africans or Central Africans knew this, they will talk about it. So
Exactly.
yeah, so
And I was actually it's funny. I was talking to my mom earlier today and I was telling her about the stream and she's like, "Okay." And she's like, "Where's Philip from?" I'm like, "I think that he's Nigerian. Are you based in Nigeria right now? Still based there?"
yeah.
So my mom's like, "Okay. Isn't it dangerous for him?" I'm like, "Yeah, he's been taken hostage before. He's fine."
Could you tell us
So
about that, maybe briefly, just for our
Oh yes, oh
listeners?
yes. I'm always happy to talk about it. So it was in first of all, for those who don't know, I have been reporting on Russian atrocities in West and Central Africa since 2018, and I stumbled on this topic by accident, I would say. So what happened? Three Russian journalists had traveled from Moscow to Bangui. Bangui is the capital of the Central African Republic in 2018. And on that trip, they were on a mission to investigate the Wagner Group, which had just begun to operate in the Central African Republic after they were invited by the president, Francine Achash Touadera, to help fight rebels and militia groups that were seeking to overthrow his government. So, unfortunately for these three Russian journalists, they were killed somewhere in Sibut. Sibut is a small town in the central part of the country. And many people accused the Russians, the Wagner group, of being behind their killing simply because these journalists had first gone to the military base where the Wagner group was operating at the time, and they tried to speak to the Wagner mercenaries, but they were not allowed to do so. So when this incident happened, my editor at the time, Christopher Dickey, reached out to me and asked if I could investigate exactly what these journalists were doing there and where they had been to and what they had come up with. So I worked alongside the Daily Beast Russian correspondent Anna Nemtsova. So while Anna was trying to understand how the journalists had traveled, you know, from Russia, she tried to piece together their itinerary in Russia before going to the Central African Republic. I looked at what they did when they arrived, where they went to, who they spoke with, and what have you. So eventually we put together a very interesting piece that was one of the most read articles in the Daily Beast on the Daily Beast website of 2018. So now, when I came up with that story, in fact, while investigating for that story, I found a lot of things that I didn't know about. I found that the Russians were involved in more than one community. I found that they were going everywhere. So I had many questions I needed answers for. So that's how I began to look deeply into the operations of the Wagner Group. Also because I felt that I owed the slain journalist, something in return, at least to be able to continue from where they stopped. So I kept, you know, looking into Wagner, but I had not really traveled into the country per se until I decided to do so in 2023. So the reason why I decided to travel was because Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group, had been killed in an air crash. And many people were not sure of what will be of the Wagner Group after the death of Prigozhin. I had questions. The entire world had questions. But the best place to know a lot about the Wagner Group anywhere in the world is the Central African Republic. If you're looking into their operations, because they have a massive network of mercenaries in this country. So I decided for the first time to go into the country. So I got to Cameroon, and from Cameroon, I decided to travel by road to the Central African Republic. Now, the reason why I was traveling by road is because I had been told the previous year by my contacts in the group that I was warned by my contacts in the group that I should never fly to Bangui. If I fly to Bangui, they said I will be arrested. Because they know this because they had been told, these Wagner mercenaries, they had been warned or they had been ordered by their commanders, their superiors, that whenever I was seen in the country, whenever any Russian paramilitary saw me in the country, they should either get me arrested or killed. So I knew I couldn't fly to Bangui, so I had to go by route to the country. So I traveled from Douala. Douala is the second, the commercial capital of Cameroon, and then I got to Gura Bulai, which is the community on the border with the Central African Republic. So I was able to cross from there to Beloko. Beloko is a town in the Central African Republic, just on the border with Cameroon. So I went into my guest house, a very lousy guest house. I mean, it's a place very poor in many ways. You can't find a good hotel there. You can't even find internet connection in the country is still on 2G.
Yeah.
So
2G.
yeah. Got to my guest house, and then the following day, I got on a commercial motorcycle and I asked the rider to take me to the border with Cameroon because I wanted to speak with artisanal miners who were fleeing the violence in the western part of the country into Cameroon. And by violence, I mean the fact that the Russians have started to seize gold mines in the western part of the country. And when they seize gold mines, they either get some miners killed or they just chase them away. So I wanted to speak with some of these miners to know exactly what was going on. Unfortunately for me, once the motorcyclist took me to the border, I saw these miners already trying to move. So I had just come down the motorcycle and was reaching out for my camera and my phone when this Hilux, Toyota Hilux pickup pulled over. And once the car pulled over, a couple of Central African soldiers came down the vehicle, and one of them rushed me, held me to my waist, and started to drag me. And at this point, I was confused, and I started to scream and ask that he left me, but he wouldn't listen. And he started to drag me on the floor, taking me away from the border. And while he was doing so, I was on the ground. I looked up and I saw two Russian paramilitaries.
So
And
how did they know that? Do you think they knew that you were going to be there, or they just recognized you?
well, I don't think they recognized me as Philip Obaji, the journalist who reports on Russia.
Yeah.
I think they saw someone who looked a lot
Like a
different.
journalist.
Yeah, or who even looked different. Yeah, like a journalist one, but also looked different from the locals. I mean, I came as this clean cut. That's the mistake I made. I should never have traveled. So yeah, so I had this clean
Next
cut.
time, just put some mud on you.
Yeah, I
Like,
think so. Clean cut, a little lighter than the average Central African from that community. and I spoke with an accent that was very different from,
Mm.
an accent that the people spoke.
Mm.
So I think in many ways the way I appeared, gave me away. So they probably thought this is something foreign, someone who's either a spy or a journalist, but whatever he is, he's not someone who is here in our interest. So that's
Yeah.
what I think they thought. So eventually, they dragged me from there and then took me to a military outpost that is very close to the border. And then there was this container, shipping container, that's stationed in the outpost or at the outpost. And then they threw me into that container and then locked me in there. So at the time I got there, I had bruises all over me, already had a fractured ankle, a broken wrist, and I was there overnight. There was no electricity, there was no food. In any case, I would not have eaten even if I was offered food. So my saving grace was this. The motorcyclist who took me to the border saw what happened. And so the following morning, he ran to a friend of his who is a senior army officer in the Central African Armed Forces. And then he pleaded with this officer to intervene. So it was the officer who came to the outpost the following morning and then pleaded with the Central African soldiers to let me go.
Wow.
Fortunately for me, the Russians were not there when the soldiers came, because I bet you they will never have allowed, that to let me go. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's my experience. And that wasn't all. After they let me go, I returned to Cameroon, bought a new camera, and then I crossed back into the Central African Republic. And look, I had traveled too far, Nick, to just go
Okay,
home empty-handed.
fair enough.
From Nigeria to Cameroon, Cameroon to Central Africa. That's a long journey.
Yeah.
So, while I was going to a place called Aba, which is one community where the Russians had invaded, unfortunately for us, myself and my driver, we were caught by the local rebels from the Union for Peace rebel group. So
I love that, the Union for Peace, and they're a rebel group. That's
yes, that's how they call themselves. So they held us for 8 hours. 8 hours were held in the bush. So the reason why they held us was because they weren't sure who we were, whether we worked for the government or, in fact, or the Russians. So I kept explaining to them, look, we're fighting the same cause. I'm here to expose the atrocities of the Russians, and you are here to fight against injustice, as you say. So I think we're also doing the
Yeah.
same thing. So it was until a senior commander came and then listened to our story and was convinced that I was a journalist who was only out there to uncover the wrongdoings of the Russians. That was when they let us go. So for 8 hours, we were held in the bush by these rebels. Yeah, so it was not an
and
easy
and
trip.
and after that, did you go back home, or were you like, nah,
No,
I need
no, no,
some,
no, it was
I
just the
need
beginning.
another
So
bit
I
of
continued to travel. I
excitement?
continued to move, and in the end, I came up with one of the biggest stories I've ever done. A story that exposed the atrocities, a massacre in a town called Koki in the northwest of the Central African Republic. I also exposed how the Russians, had raped dozens of women in a campaign that targeted young women who were not only raped but were administered contraceptives. And also an abortion campaign was also carried out by the Russians on these women. So a lot that we didn't know about was uncovered because I refused to give up on,
Mm.
on that trip. So yes, it was a very difficult experience, very tough, and I never knew that I had some level of mental toughness until that period. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, how did you deal with, like, coming back from something like that? Must have been
yeah.
quite traumatic. Like, how was it adjusting back into normal life, where we're like, nah, there's nothing normal anymore. This is my life now.
So because I have spent the last decade listening to stories about abuse, torture, and what have you, so I have begun to understand exactly what happens in conflict zones. So I started out as a journalist covering the Boko Haram insurgency in northeastern Nigeria. So I have listened to dozens, hundreds of stories of abuse, of torture, and what have you. So when I go on assignments in conflict areas, whether it's in the Sahel or whether it's in
Mm.
northern Nigeria, I tell myself in my head that it could go wrong. You could get arrested, you could be abducted. But if it happens, the fact that you've listened to some people who have been brave, tell their stories of bravery and strength, take a leap from what you've
Mm.
listened to, and then stay strong. And so when the Russians did what they did in Beloko, I kept remembering the stories of the men and women I'd listened to who, in the face of threat, of terror, they stayed defiant
Mm.
and they're strong enough and brave enough, to stay alive. So that was what helped me. And
Sure.
I think if I had never been to the Sahel or northeastern Nigeria and covered Al Qaeda and ISIS groups on what they did to people in those communities, I probably would have battled very strongly with mental health. Yeah, but I was prepared. It took me a decade to prepare for what happened
Yeah,
in
it's almost like you got, like how you get a vaccine, you got little shots of of war
I mean, you
prepared you.
describe it very well, Jana. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
look, I have listened to very terrible stories, terrible stories.
I've read some of the things
Yeah.
you've listened to,
So,
and it's horrific.
so that helped me a lot. Yeah.
It's so you mentioned that, you kind of found out that people in Africa like in South Africa don't really
Yeah.
follow or like know about what Russia's doing up north. And it's almost this thing that I've noticed in our news. Like the news that gets covered here is what Trump is doing,
Mhm.
what's going on in Israel, Palestine, and that's about it. It's almost as if, from what I've seen in the news, north of our neighbors doesn't exist. Um, and I don't know how it's weird for me to see it that even on this continent, because usually people are like, yes, no one in Europe cares, no one in America cares. But it's
Yeah.
almost like even on this continent, not everyone cares, you know?
That's correct. And it hasn't
And I don't
become.
know if it's a lack of care or a lack of knowledge, you know?
I think it's about experiences. If you want to compare what happens in Southern Africa as a whole, the entire region of Southern Africa, and what happens in West Africa and Central Africa, I mean, there's much more conflict in Central
Mm.
Africa, much more conflict in West Africa, and because these areas are mostly restive, much of these areas are restive. People have been able to become inquisitive, and when you have conflicts, you also have the issue of fake news. You have the issue of disinformation, manipulation, conspiracy theories. So these things strive in areas that have lots of conflict. And the reason why it's different also is because much of the issues we have right now, especially if you look at the issue of misinformation and disinformation, as much as this has been on for many years, many decades, what we're seeing now is something, from a different angle. The Russians have come into play, the Chinese have come into play. But the target is not so much in Southern Africa. The target is a lot in West Africa
Mhm.
and in Central Africa. Now, in Southern Africa, you have a government that is in many ways, in South Africa, sorry, you have a government that
Mm.
is in many ways very friendly to Russia. So
Mhm.
the Russians are not looking to hurt the government. If for
Ah.
anything, they're looking to strengthen
Oh,
the ANC.
yeah.
Yeah. In West Africa, the campaign is to destabilize democracy and enable change in regimes that are pro-Russian. I give an example. The first coup in recent coups, the first of the four coups
Mhm.
in West Africa started in Mali. And
I
what
remember
happened?
that one, yeah.
The military officers who carried out the coup in Mali, led by Sadio Kamara, a colonel, these officers traveled to Moscow in January of 2020. They stayed in Moscow and then they returned in the first week of August 2020. And once they returned, in just a matter of days, they toppled the government of Mohamed Keita. Assimi Goita, who is the current head of state, was part of that group who planned that coup. And what I was told, because I was the one who broke the story of these officers being in Moscow
Mm.
on training, and I revealed that they were in contact with themselves because not all of them were in Moscow. Assimi Goita was not in Moscow, But Sadio Kamara, who became defense minister, was in Moscow alongside the others. So the vast majority of the cabinet after the fall of the Keita regime were people who were in Moscow on that training, who were in contact with the other officers in Bamako. So there was a clear Russian hand in the plotting of this coup in Mali. So after Mali, the next country that fell, one of the countries that fell next was Burkina Faso. And I did a report in January of 2021. I said that the leader of the coup in Burkina Faso had gone to the president and told the president to bring the Russians to Ouagadougou, the capital, to help fight against Al Qaeda and ISIS-backed insurgents that were trying to ravage Ouagadougou. And once the president rejected that proposal, he was toppled a month after. So in many ways, you still see a Russian, hand
Yeah.
in there. So what you also see now in across West Africa is massive Russian disinformation trying to undermine democratically elected governments in West Africa. So in Niger, the people already started to call for Russian involvement before even the coup that toppled the democracy. And after the coup happened, you saw Russian flags being waved by demonstrators.
I remember
People said
that.
we want the Russians to be part of Niger. So in Nigeria, once when there was a protest a year ago, Russian flag anti-government protest, Russian flags were waved by a lot of the demonstrators. So you see a trend, a pattern of the Russians trying to undermine democracy and pave way for conflict and chaos, and eventually for a regime that will be pro-Russian. So that's not the focus in South Africa. The focus in South Africa is to try to make the ANC look good. I mean, there are a lot of campaigns in South African social media that people with large following, including one called his handle at _African soil. I think it's amplified by Zemazwasi Majosi, right? You've heard that name before?
No.
Okay, so it's a very popular South African account with 160,000
Uh-huh.
followers. Yeah.
I
So
got blocked by quite a few of the big South African accounts
okay.
because
So
I was calling out their nonsense. It goes a
the
bit
name
over
of
the
the
top.
account is what's it called? Fiti Evaluator. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that account is already been identified as a pro-Russian account with massive following. And what it does is that it blends local political commentary with Russian aligned messaging.
Yeah.
And much of this messaging is anti-Ukraine. So, and you also know that there was this hashtag that trended in South Africa. I stand with Russia. I stand with Putin.
And that was started by Zuma's daughter.
Yeah.
And
So you
but
see,
what was funny with that one, right? Because I was watching that because full scale invasion happened and she changed her profile picture to the Russian flag.
that's correct. So
And the moment Prigozhin died, her engagement dropped.
you're talking about Zuma Sambudia?
No, Duruzile Zuma.
Yeah, that's yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Zuma, yeah, Zuma, yeah. So she's
yeah.
one of those who really was behind that hashtag. So you see, even the ANC and MK, they have they're the ones who are benefiting a lot from this whole pro-Russian campaign. So they also use automated accounts and
Yeah.
troll farms to amplify this messaging. So it's a big issue. So it's mostly pro government. So that's why you will not see a lot of chaos and people really having
Okay.
these debates that much
That's
in South
kind
Africa.
of reassuring in a weird way. Like just uphold the status quo, even though the status quo is not ideal.
Yeah, that's
So it's
that's the tactic. So if,
yeah.
if you look at what happened in Madagascar in 2019 in the build up to the elections, now the Russians had their candidate, and when they saw that he was not popular, they quickly switched into supporting the eventual winner, Andrei Rajoelina, who became president of Madagascar. And they did this through the media. They created a Russian funded newspaper that became the most widely circulating newspaper, and they did all manner of influencing on social media, and even on mainstream media as well. So their focus was having a government that will be pro-Russia. So you don't get to see too many Russian disinformation in the Central African Republic because the government is already pro-Russia. So the target these days are countries that are neutral or countries that are
Okay.
pro-West. And I think the most discreet campaign ever, like the most maybe mild but
Mm.
still strong campaign we've seen is in South Africa. Yeah, where they're not creating chaos; they're just amplifying
Yeah.
NP and ANC. That's all they're doing. Yeah, not the chaos. And
Are
then
you
just
familiar with Daily Maverick? It's one of
yeah,
the news. So
yeah,
they did a piece on the fake influencers on Twitter, right?
yeah,
On how there was, you know, this, I think it was a mayor that just came out of
mm,
nowhere and suddenly everyone's talking about him. And they started looking in behind the accounts. I have a friend who also looked into some of these things, and he found a, one of, those troll farms. There's one in, so I'm in Joburg, right? There's one in
mm-hmm,
Midrand. That's like half an hour to 45 minutes away from me. They found the location, everything. So it's happening, but it's almost like a lot. And I know a lot of South Africans have decided, you know what, they're on Twitter, they're not on Twitter, they're not on Facebook,
mm,
they're on Instagram and TikTok, right? So I think from a media perspective, and the media landscape has also shifted a bit in South Africa. Um, but we're seeing it, if you know what to look for, you spot it, right? But
yeah,
I think it's not as blatantly obvious. Like you said, it's a more subtle campaign.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing that they have done in South Africa is the fact that they have tried to make Ukraine seem like a very bad country. So a lot of the disinformation that you find on social media in South Africa, in particular, targeted at Ukraine,
Yeah.
saying how Ukraine is supporting Western ideologies, helping the West to set up bioweapon labs here in Africa. So that has been the core of what the Russians have done, targeting South Africa, just to make sure that Ukraine has no
Yeah.
friends. Yeah.
It's scary, like when you take a step, because obviously, like, you can go through your day-to-day life and decide not to pay attention to this, but when you step back and you look at these things, you're kind of like, okay, how do I go back to not to like ignoring this again? And then you can't, because you see it everywhere. So that was actually one of my topics
Yeah.
on my notes, was kind of how things are more, um and you clarified it, because I was like, why do we have more subtle campaigns in South Africa and more like almost overtly aggressive disinfo campaigns and misinfo campaigns um, in the Sahel and Northern Africa and West Africa? And you've covered that now.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you for that. Um, I came across a report from the Center for African Studies, and then I looked at the
Okay.
bottom, and they're based in Washington, and I'm like, can't we have an African center in Africa?
Very good question. I mean, there's also the Africa Center for Strategic Studies,
Mhm.
which is based in Washington, and they have
Yeah.
done most of the
Yeah, sorry, it's
research.
them. Yeah, it's them I'm
That's them.
talking about.
Okay, so they
Yeah.
have done
Yeah.
the vast. In fact, the majority of research on this information in Africa is done by the
Was
Africa
done by
Center.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I've got many friends there. They held a couple of workshops in West Africa, one in Nigeria, another one in Ghana, which was aimed at training journalists on how to identify
Mm.
misinformation and disinformation and how to counter these narratives. And I was at their office in Washington last year and spoke to the heads of this organization. Well, it still goes down to what we have always talked about, we Africans, is that oftentimes ideas and policies that are aimed at improving Africa, most times these ideas are always crafted elsewhere, whether it's in
Yeah.
Washington or London or in Brussels, whatever. Now, that's always my concern, that we allow outsiders to try to tell us how we should operate or how we should deal with issues
Mm.
on the continent, and which has got to change. That has got to change. We have to get to a point where we as Africa can work together to agree on something. I mean, it's a shame that we talked about this free trade, Africa free trade, arrangement, where African leaders have for many years been deliberating on what to do in terms of free movement of persons and goods across the continent. And many countries are against it. South Africa, for example, is not really in tune with that because it fears that many other African nations will just begin to travel there, and then I can understand that fear. But then, if we cannot, as politicians, even deal with issues as simple as this issue of free trade, even if we're not having free movement, but at least free trade,
Yeah, at least free trade. I mean,
yeah, then how easy will it be to deal with other issues that really don't even concern government that much? So that
yeah.
it's a huge problem, a big worry. And I have already started to speak with a lot of friends here in Nigeria and across West Africa to see how we can start a research institute that will really focus strongly on this. And it's in the making because I feel that it's important that we start to do as us.
Yeah.
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 So yeah.
I think because it's so I come from a marketing background and Nick comes from a PR background, right?
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that we studied at university was kind of you look at your international brands that
Yeah.
then have one person for Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I'm like, two very different places. And you can't even just have one person in charge of all of
Yeah.
Africa because there's so many cultures. And that person isn't from either of those regions. But then they wonder why marketing campaigns flop, and it's almost the same thing. Like you have to have that knowledge of the culture and that understanding of it. And I think in a sense also, we all kind of love the place we grow up, most of us. We have a kind of attachment to it. And it's kind of a thing of, people who aren't from here don't get that. So there are certain concepts that are almost like inherently African. Like,
Yeah.
I try to explain Ubuntu to people and they're like,
Yeah.
huh? You know? But there are certain concepts that are just ingrained in the culture. And yeah, I think you've mentioned, you've hit the nail on the head. Like all these solutions are crafted outside of Africa
Yeah,
with,
that's correct. That's correct.
yeah.
And the other big worry that I have, that many people have, is the fact that it's become too easy to use Africa as tools for a lot of influence and manipulations. For example, I did a documentary. I was part of a team of
I watched it.
for Al Jazeera. Now, when we traveled, we went to Togo, we went to Burkina Faso, and we spoke to many journalists on the ground. And we realized that what Russia was paying for articles that I cleared this information was as little as $80 per article. And um, there were people who told me off the record that even if they had gotten $20, they would accept and then do what the Russians want them to do. So you see that some people don't even care as long as they're making money off it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things. Like, if you're hungry, you're hungry.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you look at your family and your family doesn't have opportunities, and here comes an opportunity, I think it gets to a point where you're like, you know what? It comes down to survival here.
That's correct. So there's a lot of work to be done to deal with disinformation because as long as people are hungry, some will continue to do what they offer to do. And the one way, like I have made a lot of suggestions as to how to deal with this, because most times the journalists will accept pay, to publish this information. They don't control these media houses, so they collect money and then file a story to the editor, and the editor make sure it's published. So I suggested that there has to be programs, workshops that target the owners of media houses in Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, because many owners are not cheap. So like publishers some of them, the ones that work for the biggest brands, the biggest newspapers, are not cheap. They will not accept $20 or $50 or whatever. And some of them will want to even protect their image, but they're not aware that their staff, journalists, and editors are collecting money to publish this stuff. So I have suggested, to many bodies, whether it's in Europe or America, who can fund programs or who can actually on their own create programs that really tell publishers and heads of media corporations exactly what's going on and how they can help combat this. Yeah.
But one of the things I think last time we spoke, we discussed how Russia almost started these small um, media outlets, or and endorsed them in a way to spread misinformation. And in South Africa, what we have is not going to say their name because I don't want to get like,
Yeah, I get.
you know, um, but they recently signed off from the press code. They signed off in October 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because the press code is how you are held accountable if you publish
Mm-hmm.
something that's not true. They had a bunch of charges against, like complaints against them, and they were like, "We're not going to address this. We're not going um, to say that we lied. We're just gonna quit the press code. What are you going to do now?" But people still read them because that the fact that they signed off from the press code wasn't published, wasn't broadcasted. So um, it's it's a weird thing to look at in that sense, where you have, and this is a big media house in South Africa. They have several like print media, on digital media, everything, and they are the owner of of the company has shook hands with Putin.
Aren't
Um,
other publishing houses able to publish about that fact?
they are probably, and but you won't get them to, they probably won't do it.
Hmm.
Um, it's so I work a lot on the activist side of things, right? And I've spoken to other activists as well. We had the Human Rights Festival here in South Africa, um, and I spoke to all the other activists there, and I had one question because it was people from like all different things, like from socioeconomic activism to helping refugees to everything, all across. And I asked him, I'm like, are you getting media coverage? Are you able to get your articles in the news? Are you able to even get your press releases published? And they all said no. One organization, the Helen Suzman Foundation, they said yes. And they said very rarely, but yes, and only because our head of PR used to be a journalist. One of the organizers, or one of the activist groups, told me they wanted to get this published, and they were told the South African public doesn't care about it. Thousands of people attended this 3-day human rights festival. Everyone passed the stand. And you're telling me that people do not care about these things. So I feel like, and I don't know how to bridge that gap. I don't know how to bridge the gap from almost activism to the general public. And usually that's where the media should come in and play a role. So I don't know, maybe you have.
I think you have to start with talking to your colleagues in the media, some of your
Mm,
friends, because you're not many in South Africa right now who
mm,
really understand what's going on, who are even interested in getting involved. Because like I noticed last year, a lot of issues, many issues, including the issues around Russia, is something that people are not really receptive towards. Like they're not really ready to talk about these issues. So talking to colleagues who maybe of like minds could be a good start.
mm.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
for me, it's still a struggle here in Nigeria or even in West Africa talking about Russian operations because people still are feeling that the West have been very, very bad in the past, which I agree towards Africans. I agree that there were many things that were done by the Western countries that really should not have been, were inhuman. But I'm talking about now. I mean, that was in the
Mm.
past. I'm talking about now. If a Western nation stands against West Africa or Nigeria or whatever, I would also stand against that nation in terms of the things that I say. So it's still a challenge. So you can imagine how the average West African, particularly if the average Francophone Africa, believes that the West is an enemy. So, but despite that, I'm still speaking, still talking to like minds, still
Mm.
getting more people to listen, to read what I post, to listen to what I say, and what have you. So, Jana, maybe you could start in that
Maybe,
regard.
yeah. I've thought about doing that, but I just don't know where to start. I was like, maybe like start a blog featuring different activists, start something small, but I'm like, I don't know how to I know how to do it physically. But it's almost like the strategy side behind it. Also, Olia in chat actually made a comment because something that happens in South Africa quite a bit is Russia will fund like blogger tours. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I remember there was and it's mostly aimed at Generation Z and younger. So it's on TikTok, it's on Instagram, and it's like these TikTokers who they went to Crimea
Mm-hmm.
during to celebrate the annexation.
Yeah.
And they basically got a whole tour of Russia and the annexation, and they celebrated it as look how great Russia is. And brought
Yeah.
their South African. They have a big South African audience. They went there, they came back, they got paid. And there's like there's no I don't there's no one who counters that narrative, and I don't know anyone who would be willing to counter that really like to that level. Um because I mean, I'm sure you've heard it as well. You're a sellout if you're saying like, no, but these guys are wrong. If you're
Yeah.
like,
Of
oh,
course.
why you
Yeah.
prefer the colonizer, and you're like,
Yeah.
this is
True.
neocolonialism, guys.
You've got to be ready for this, Jana, because you're
Mm,
going to hear a lot of that. People will tell you that you're a sellout, that you are an agent of the West and what have you. You're going to hear that a lot. And yeah, sometimes you feel so isolated. But over time, there will be people who will be listening and who will agree with you over time. It could take a long
mm.
time, but then you
Have
have
you
to start.
found there are particular messages that you find, let's say, people in Nigeria are more receptive to when you talk about those in terms of framing what Russia's doing in Africa?
Well, there are not too many people, I have to be honest, Nick. In the beginning, there were more people who were like, we don't care, or who were mostly, you're not saying the truth. There were also others who are like, you are supporting the same people who were imperialists in the past. But now there are people, new people who are with me on this, appreciating the work and believing so strongly that Russia's agenda is really so anti-democracy and what have you. But it's still a challenge. As you're getting more people who are with you on this matter, there are also more people who are coming up against issues like this. More people who are pro-Russia, growing, because the Russians are spending so much money on RT that broadcasts from Algiers, on local terrestrial stations in the Sahel. And that's a lot of money going into this messaging, so much money going into propaganda and misinformation. And because we're still in a society where there's lots of agitation, poverty is growing, economic downturn, so people are always susceptible to this manner of messaging, misinformation and disinformation. So it's very tough. And Jana, you're going to face a lot of backlash. Just know this. But you
Yeah.
have to keep at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also, I know that you have a voice. I mean, on platforms like this, you are having a lot of people get involved. On social media, I know that on X that you are building momentum to as well. When your blog comes alive, there will be an opportunity to say exactly what you know,
Mm.
what we should be going to, and what have you. But I also would like you to interact with people in the media community. if you can.
I will. I have a few numbers, but they usually contact me, so maybe I'll contact them a bit.
Yeah, you could do so. And if
Yeah.
you have time in Joburg during the Africa Investigative
I
Journalism
actually want to
Conference,
ask, can I
I will, I
come?
will, I will, I think that you have to be part of that. If I can get you to meet
That
some
would
of
be
the people,
awesome. Yes,
mm,
please. I would. I
yeah,
would. I was actually going to ask you if it's possible, if
mhm.
general
there,
public can attend.
there should be a way. I will find out better on
Okay.
how you can get
Thank
involved.
you.
Yeah, yeah, because I want you involved.
Because one of
Yeah.
the things that you posted recently was, I had the tweet open, but how Russia is working with Libya to kind of start a bit of a um,
So, like, if you
destabilization issue there.
exactly. So, to understand Libya, I will have to go back a bit. Now, after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya descended into a civil war, and eventually a war fought by government forces, which is the UN-backed government, against, or let's say the war was brought by a rogue general called General Haftar. So he was seeking, he did not agree with the UN-backed government in Tripoli. So he started to fight against this government, to eventually conquer the entire country. But that war has not made much progress from either side. So what we have in Libya now is a government that is in control of Tripoli and a few other parts, and a rebel government or a rebel group that is in control of Benghazi and the others and some other parts of Libya. So you have two governments running Libya right now. Now, during the fighting between the government forces and General Haftar's forces, the Russians backed General Haftar. So the Wagner group came into Libya supporting Haftar's forces. So a lot of sophisticated equipment were flown from Russia through Syria and eventually to Libya. So much of what Haftar's forces have in terms of sophistication of equipment came from Russia through the Wagner group. So now, what you find in Libya now are many armed groups in the fallout of the fall of Gaddafi and the civil war. So there are a lot of armed groups now who also try to control some very small areas, especially around the coastal region. And these armed groups now are all trying to make money off migration. So Nick, I don't know if you're conversant with how migration works in the West Africa routes. So the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africans who seek to get to Europe through the Sahara Desert and through the Mediterranean Sea actually converge in Niger in the town called Agadez. So Agadez is the hub of people smuggling and human trafficking in West
Right.
Africa. So for many years, Agadez has always allowed people smuggling to thrive. So what happens if somebody from Nigeria is seeking to get to Europe through the Sahara Desert and through Libya? The person has to find his or her way to Agadez. So when they get to Agadez, the next thing they do is to find a smuggler that will take them across the desert into Libya. So finding that smuggler is not difficult, but the problem is finding a day to travel because you have thousands of people who converge in Agadez every day. But the vehicles, the cars, the smugglers move in pickup trucks in convoys only on Tuesdays. You get so every Tuesday you find dozens of pickup vehicles leaving Agadez. In fact, they live in police convoys, in police escorts. So you could have you have dozens of these vehicles, and each car, each pickup carries about 20 to 25 migrants. So if you are lucky to find your name on the manifest for next week, then you travel. If you're not lucky, you wait another week or another week. So when they travel across the desert, not everybody that travels across the desert get to Libya. Most of them fall off the bed of the vehicle in the desert and then they're covered by sand. Because when you fall off, the driver doesn't stop. Because if the driver stops, he could either be arrested by maybe the military, or maybe if he stops, he could be captured by rebels or militia groups. So he has to keep driving. So when they get to Libya, they eventually are kept somewhere. These migrants they are lodged somewhere where they also have to wait to get on boats that take them across the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the why the Russians coming is this: it is not the government that helps you get on boats. It's organized crime. It's network of groups,
Mm.
criminal groups. Now, these days, the Wagner group is also part of this network that look for boats for these migrants to cross. So it's become more difficult now. Now, for many years, this smuggling was easy. But what happened in 2015? The EU met and decided to fund the governments in both Niger and in Libya to be able to stem the migrant flow. So in Niger, they funded the government to the tune of 32 million euros or so for the government to ensure that Agadez no longer becomes the hub for smuggling. So the government made sure that the parliament enacted a law in 2015 that criminalized people smuggling in Niger. So once the law passed, the government went to Agadez to dismantle all those homes where people go to sit down and wait.
So who was in charge of Agadez?
Agadez is a town in Niger, which the
Yeah.
government also, of course. So,
So
but what happened?
the government provided the police escorts for those vehicles as well?
So it wasn't the government who provided the police escorts. It was the criminal gangs that paid the policemen
Ah, right.
to
Okay.
escort them. Yeah. So, but
Nick, we can see you're not from Africa. That
so the
question.
criminal
I'm just
gangs
trying to
paid.
understand.
Yeah, the criminal gangs paid the police. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the government, but criminal gangs. And the police
Yeah.
is so corrupt they can allow for this. So, but what happened? When the law was passed in 2015, but when the Russia-backed military government in Niger seized power 2 years ago, one of the first things they did was to abolish that law. So effectively, what they did was to decriminalize people smuggling. So as we speak today, Nick and Jana, Agadez has become a hub again of people smuggling. Now, this is what the Russians do in Niger. The Russians have kept on radio channels in the social media. The Russians keep telling people through a lot of these middlemen that they pay, these trolls. They tell people that Europe has become a better place, or Europe has become, Europe is open to Africans to travel to. And they keep telling Africans in Nigerians that, there's conflict in the country, there's poverty, and Europe is looking for migrants, so you can always travel. They even tell you how you can get on vehicles, how you can find smugglers. So this is a lot of commentators on local radio channels are the ones saying this, and these commentators are clearly pro-Russian. So that's what's happening. So Russia is helping people get on vehicles in Agadez to Libya. And while in Libya, the Wagner group is helping people get on boats that cross the Mediterranean. So even in Libya, the EU had funded the Libyan Coast Guard.
Mhm.
They've equipped them to be able to stop migrants from traveling. I have a problem with the way the Coast Guard go about, this, because they arrest people indiscriminately, take them to the cells, inhuman cells, and then they lock them up, and then all manner of abuses go on in these cells. So that's my issue. I have a problem with what's going on, how they treat migrants. But eventually, the biggest issue is this: that the Wagner and a lot of criminal gangs in Libya are the ones pushing these migrants across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe.
And so what exactly is Wagner's role in this? Do they provide protection to the criminals? Do they point the migrants towards different criminal organizations, or
All,
what exactly are they doing?
all of that, all of that. So you have the General Haftar forces, which are made up of different factions, but all work together.
Yeah.
And also criminal gangs. They also groups linked to so-called Islamic State and Al Qaeda. But the main gangs who control these migrant groups are the gangs that are actually friendly with the Russians. So the Russians are advising these people on where to go to, what bus to take, even helping these gangs to be able to coordinate the movement
Yeah.
of migrants on these boats. So that's what we see mostly in Libya. So
So
they're
one
involved.
thing, yeah, sorry,
Go ahead.
one thing Nick and I spoke about a bit earlier is you kind of see this thing where Russia is obviously part of driving migrants to Europe. That destabilizes Europe. And then the interesting thing, if you look at it, your parties that are super anti-immigration and anti-migration are often your right-wing parties. Like you've got
That's correct.
Reform UK, you've got AFD in Germany, you've got Marine Le Pen's party in France. And if you uncover them a bit, they're also some more outspoken than others, quite pro-Russian. So it's this big cycle of
Yeah,
really,
you can see the story from end to end.
Yes.
yeah.
They started
And
from the beginning, encouraging people, lying to them, telling them, "Oh, it's okay
No,
for
it
you to
started
say."
with destabilizing the country and then lying
yeah,
to them about how much it's destabilized, and then
Yeah.
you missed the first step.
yeah. I mean, it's also confusing sometimes. I remember when I started to talk about migration to Europe, some people called me to warn me. They said, if you talk about this, your messaging is arming the right wing in Europe. So then I said, because my job is to become this. My job as a journalist is to say what's true, to say
Mm.
what I'm saying. And I said, well, I'm not playing politics in Europe. I'm doing my job as a journalist. So whether it favors the right wing or what, that's not my responsibility. I just want to tell this story. But then you begin to wonder again. I mean, if right wing politics in Europe is so pro Russia and they are also pro anti immigration, so how does this benefit Russia overall? So I
I
think
think they just want to sow discord. They
yeah,
just
like
they just want
They also
disagreement.
gain influence in European politics by
mhm.
funding these parties that are trying to sow discord about migrants.
That's correct. That's correct. So that was exactly what I concluded in my head. That this is
Mm.
what the whole thing is about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I think hearing these things, it's always like you hear it and you're like, okay, now what do we do about it? You know?
Yeah. I mean, we
And
can
that's the thing. We're like,
we can
what
only
now?
keep talking about it. And
Yeah.
okay, for me, I have had the privilege these days of speaking in various platforms, on what's going on. That's the best I can do, or that's the least I can do, because I don't have the political power to change anything. Yeah.
Mm.
So, but at least the best we can do is to tell the world this is what's happening, and to try to see if there will be more effort being put into dealing with issues around disinformation in particular, which is really eating through the spectrum. I will be very happy to go to South Africa this November and have a lot of people listen to what
Mm.
is going on and tell them from experience of what's happening in West Africa. And that's what I want to talk about in Joburg. Russian operations in West Africa and how that has destabilized West Africa, and also warn South Africa of the imminent threat of
Mm.
this. I know it's very difficult because you look at BRICS. BRICS has become a bloc that a lot of Africans
Yeah.
appreciate, and South Africa is one of the founding members of BRICS, and the prospect of having Russia as a good friend, you
Mm.
know, as a good economic power that will marry ideas with. And President Trump hasn't helped matters with the
No, he
whole.
hasn't.
Yeah, so that even plays into the hands of the Russians. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's interesting for me, right? Because obviously, you get your anti-immigration South Africans as well, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not just white South Africans, black South Africans as well,
Mm.
who are against, they are pro-Trump. And I'm like, it's like this, and like I guess the values are we don't like immigrants, you know?
Yeah.
And I guess if that's your main thing, that you're it's one thing to be for your own people, it's a different thing to be against others, you know? But nowadays it's kind of like it's become one and the same in
It's
a
amazing
sense,
how
you know?
immigration has become one of the most, in fact, the most important topic, so to speak, in global
Mm.
politics. You look at the US. I mean, Donald Trump gained momentum in his campaign. MAGA has been mostly built around issues on immigration. The US elections was actually real fought and won on immigration.
Yeah.
Europe's biggest topic today is immigration. And even the reason why the Africa Free Trade Agreement has not been able to see the daylight. It's because of issues around immigration. You get, and I mean, in Nigeria we have ECOWAS. So in West Africa we have ECOWAS, the West African regional body, and one of the items that ECOWAS has is the issue of free movement. So if you come from Niger, Benin,
Mm.
Nigeria, Mali, and whatever you can move across the region freely. And sometimes I feel that that didn't help us in some ways because a lot of times people who are terrorists have crossed the border into Nigeria. The reason why we faced a lot of issues around Boko Haram was because a lot of people who came to fight for Boko Haram were foreigners.
Thank you
What
for
was
explaining that because I was wondering, I'm like, how did these people just cross the border? But now you've explained it.
so
There's
with
a
ECOWAS
whole.
is free movement, so people can move in
Yeah.
and out across the ECOWAS sub-region. So I can understand why when you talk about the Africa Free Trade Agreement, countries like South Africa are careful because you don't want a situation where you have, particularly from Zimbabwe, with respect to Zimbabwe, you have a lot of Zimbabweans trying to move across the border freely. So if you make it free, then you have more from Zimbabwe and other countries,
Mm.
Lesotho and other countries flooding into South Africa. So we as Nigeria, we don't have too much of that problem because already our neighbors are moving in and out freely. But if South Africa perhaps had said were in support of the free movement, I believe that that would have happened today. Like that Africa
Mm.
Free Trade Agreement will become, something that is already happening. But I can understand why why South Africans are being skeptical about this. Let's face
Mm.
it. Yeah, you have a country that for many years was built similar to what we find in Europe. I mean, much of it. So you don't want countries where there's crisis, where there's
Mm.
instability, and people are flogging into your countries. But I hope we can find a solution to this in future, because I'd like
Yeah.
to see a more formidable, a stronger Africa trade-wise. Yeah.
And I think also if Africa becomes stronger in that sense and it becomes able to take care of it's a weird, I can't think of the word, but able to take care of itself, I think also um, Russia would have less of a foothold
That's correct.
because they would have their message would just not take it wouldn't take root because what you want to offer me a job, I already have a job. um you want to oust our president who is corrupt for a more corrupt guy, but
Mhm.
I mean, okay, but we kind of like this guy, so I think that is a thing that you know if a country or a region does well. I'm saying that, and as I'm saying it, I realize the reality doesn't necessarily back me up on this one. Because
Yeah, I
I'm like,
mean,
you look at countries, you're like, no, Europe does well, and then you look at Europe and you're like, okay, they've got quite a bit of a Russian problem.
So what you're
yeah.
saying is, if you improve the standard of living, quality of life for people, they won't need to depend on Russia. Yeah, I think that's
That's
nice.
Yeah, that sounds normal. And then I think of
How
Europe,
is it? Yeah.
and I think how it plays out in
Yeah, I
reality, and I'm
mean,
like, no, wait, that doesn't hold.
that's correct. Well, what Europe is facing right now is one huge disinformation, the threat of Russia invading neighboring countries, and that's why they talk about NATO and NATO being strong and NATO alliance being better. So in Africa, it's deeper than that. Um, there is no military threat to Russia in Africa. So what's most important to Russia is economic and having more allies. By having more allies, it means that you can have resolutions in the EU to your advantage. By having more allies, it also means that you can evade EU and US sanctions. And
Mm.
we've seen what's happening in the Central African Republic, where a lot of gold has left the country, sold in the
Yeah.
Middle East, and offered more money for Russia in its war against Ukraine. So disinformation has been the greatest tool that the Russians have used.
Yeah.
And through this information, they've been able to help install governments that are pro-Russia. Through this information, they've been able to create strongholds in countries where they're mining, especially in Mali and in the Central African Republic. So Europe is still facing the same issue with disinformation. Yes, and how that is feeding its politics, both left and right. But we haven't seen a state capture, so to speak, in Europe, except for the fact that we don't understand where some countries are running into, like Hungary, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Hungary,
So,
Slovakia to certain extent.
yeah. So in that sense, yes. But I think the challenge is mostly with us in Africa, where with a little dollar, we
Mm,
could actually get things done. Yeah.
yeah. I remember, like, it was interesting for me. I was still doing copywriting work, and I
Mhm.
got contacted by a guy who works for a company in Canada. And he's like, cool, okay, we're looking for writers. And I gave him my hourly tariff, but I gave him my South African rate,
Mhm.
and which was, he's like, no, we're not willing to pay that much.
Mm.
And I'm like, I'm at the lower end of the spectrum for copywriting in South Africa. Maybe go look on Facebook for people if you want copywriting. This is for serious people. So, but there is definitely the thing of like cheap labor in Africa, and it's almost like that thing that one of the things that was funny for me, right, is um obviously uh, Africa doesn't know, like, in general, doesn't know that much about Russia and Ukraine. I found out when I met some Russians, they were like, "You're from Africa?" I'm like, "Yes." And they're like, "And your parents?" I'm like, "Also." And they're like, "And their parents?" I'm like, "Also." And they're like, "Why are you white?" And I'm like, colonialism. And they're like, "What's that?" I'm like, "Oh, that's what you're doing in Ukraine." Like, that's what you guys, that's why your country is so big. But it's weird, and it's almost like not addressing that issue, and not addressing or even willing to acknowledge it causes this problem as well, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh, Liam in chat says I'm white because I have really good sunscreen. Yeah. Um, so we have covered everything on my list.
Mhm.
One thing I wanted to ask was like, because you said earlier you've been doing this for many years now. Since, like, two questions: how did the how did Russia's influence in Africa and Wagner's influence change after the full-scale invasion, or if it did it at all? And also, did it change at all after Prigozhin's death?
So in terms of its influence in Africa after the invasion, I think what even brought global attention to what the Russians are doing in Africa is the invasion in Ukraine.
Mhm.
So because they have been they had been in Africa, the Wagner group were in Libya in 2018, Madagascar 2019, Mozambique around the same year, in Sudan, yeah, around 2019 or so, yeah. So in fact, they were across the continent, but no one paid attention, or no one even were concerned until Wagner became at the forefront of the war in Ukraine. So that's why people were like, "Oh, this group, what are they doing? What are they? Who are they?" So the Ukraine war brought attention to the Wagner Group's operations in Africa. Yeah. So even me as a journalist, not many people knew where I was until the full scale invasion.
Did it change the way that they operate?
So it didn't change the way they operate. Yeah, it only made people know more about them
Mhm.
because they were already active everywhere. In fact, right now as we speak, they're not in as many countries as they were before the invasion because they're no longer active in Sudan now there's a war. They're no longer active in Mozambique. They're no longer fully active in Libya and today as a way in many years back.
Mhm.
Yeah, but they are finding new grounds, which is what they see as beneficial to them based on how successful they were or they have been in in the Central African Republic. When I say successful, I mean successful in doing business in exploitation. Yeah. So the Ukraine invasion did not change in any way how they operate in Africa. In fact, most of the fighters that fought in Ukraine were pulled from Africa. Many mercenaries left Africa to go fight in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, since Prigozhin died, what we have seen change is the fact that first of all, you have the Russian Ministry of Defense supervising the operations of the Wagner Group in Africa. So you don't, well, there are still atrocities happening in Africa. I don't hear them happening in as much brutality as they were under Prigozhin, but it still continues to happen. They're still seeking to expand. Yeah, and the numbers after Prigozhin have not increased steadily. Rather, they have maintained the number of about, say, 1,000 plus. Yeah, that they have right now. But under Prigozhin, it got to 2,000, got to more than 2,000. When the war started, they sent some back to Russia. Then they also brought in new people.
Mhm.
Yeah, so in terms of change, we haven't seen too much in terms of operations. Yeah.
Thank you. Nick, I'll have you know, I'll already have Philip telling me he's joining me for another stream, but you won't be there. Olia will be there because she was upset when I said you're here.
Sorry, Olia.
So, Philip, thank you so much for being here. I'll see you
Thank
in
you for having
November.
me. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, surely.
Yeah,
Look
thanks.
forward
It
to
was,
it.
it was really interesting.
Awesome.
Nick,
Thanks.
hope we can see you again.
Yeah, me
Okay.
too. For sure.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.